For granted after a Conservative minister all but conceded defeat. The Work and Pension Secretary Mel Stride told LBC earlier he believes their rivals are on course for a landslide. His Labour counterpart Liz Kendall told LBC they're still fighting for every vote.
None of this is done. We have to vote for it. It isn't just a line that we're saying. There's over 100 constituencies in this country where it is too close to call.
Reform says it's offering real change, while the SNP believes many seats in Scotland are too close to call. The Lib Dems are focusing on care and the NHS. A judge has ruled there is sufficient evidence for former leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, to stand trial over historical sex offences. He's previously said he'll strenuously deny the accusations. Two men have been charged with murder more than 6 years after a 17-year-old girl was killed in a drive-by shooting in North London. Tanisha Melbourne Blake was shot in Tottenham in 2018. The daughter and son-in-law of Captain Sir Tom Moore have been banned from being charity trustees. The Charity Commission made the decision as an inquiry continues into the foundation set up in Sir Tom's name. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 49 points at 81.71. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.18. LBC weather largely dry tonight, some blustery showers in the northwest and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question, the last one before polling day. Next week, we're hoping to have 4 new MPs in the studio for one of our Cross Questions. Haven't got a clue who they'll be, of course, at the moment. But we have, I was going to say 4 old stagers with me, but that would be very cruel on at least 3 of them. So Bob Neill joins us, unless he wants to walk out after that comment. Former Conservative MP, he's just stood down from chairing the Commons Justice Committee. Alys Denby, Opinion and Features Editor of City AM. Andrew Fisher, former Executive Director of Policy for the Labour Party. And Joe Twyman, co-founder and director of the public opinion consultancy Deltapoll. Lots to ask our panel tonight. 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp on that number or you can text 84850. And of course we are available for you to watch on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Craig in Glasgow. Craig, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening, Iain and panel. Hope you're all well. I would like to ask, how honest has this election been?
That's the shortest question in the 6-year history of Cross Question. Well done. How honest has this election campaign been? Joe Twyman.
Well, I think if you ask the general public, they would take a pretty dim view of this whole election. Not a political party or even a individual politician, but instead the political class generally. Trust in these institutions and indeed in politicians particularly has been declining for many years now, but it's accelerated in recent years. And I think that the stage-managed nature of the campaign this time around, only building on what we've seen in previous campaigns, will probably simply help to reinforce that view.
Do you think it reached a new low yesterday when this party of family values criticised Keir Starmer for wanting to spend time with his family?
I think you could point to a number of different things throughout the campaign where parties and politicians have been inconsistent with their messages and with their history.
But is that any different from, say, 1992, 1983, 1974?
I think politicians have always been economical with the truth, but I think that in the days of, and I don't want to view these things with rose-tinted glasses, but in the days of morning press conferences every morning, and then politicians going out on a soapbox a la John Major in 1992, and being surrounded by members of the public was something that we simply didn't see this time around. And I think that has a certain, I would describe it as emotional honesty to it. And instead we have endless stage, and this is not a criticism of any one party, they're all at it, endless stage-managed photo opportunities with industrial equipment, high-vis jackets and sometimes lifeboats.
Bob Neill, do you hanker after the days of those press conferences every morning in Central Office where Margaret Thatcher would appear with probably half the cabinet? Now, of course, the press just asked questions to her generally, but at least they were there to talk about policy.
Well, I'm glad you recognise I'm the only person in the room apart from yourself who can remember then, Ian. But I think to a degree, yeah. And I think to come directly to the question, I think at a national level, all the parties, I agree, have fallen into a sort of a groupthink now, which is very controlled, very much spun all the time. But the distinction I would draw, actually, is I think at local level, there's 650 local campaigns being fought as well. And I think there, quite often, you do find candidates, individual candidates, who are much more willing, I think, to go beyond the message sometimes. And that's not a bad thing. And I suspect those who are prepared to own up to where things have gone wrong from their own side's point of view, to talk about actually some of the local issues, not necessarily to be in pure attack mode against their opponents all the time, that I do think has a resonance with some people. That's certainly, I've been on the doors in my old constituency in Bromley before I came up here. And I think that does have a resonance. Happens we've got a very civilised campaign down there where people aren't taking trunks out of each other, but we're talking about some of the important issues. I think we need more of that, certainly, and I'd like to see them more of that on the national stage. So in broad terms, yeah, I think probably you can't get away with those old systems now, but I don't think the idea where everything is so stage managed and everything is so risk averse and sort of so on script that it's almost anemic and it doesn't have any sort of genuine integrity to it. Any really
but in a sense, this campaign has been quite anemic. There've been you've had the set piece national debates, but only two of them with the leaders.
Yeah.
You've had very few head-to-heads between the ministers and their shadows. James Cleverly and Yvette Cooper did one in this studio, but I can't remember many others. But even in 2015 or 2017, I think you'll remember, Andrew. I mean, Andrew Neill did on the Daily Politics did loads of sort of head-to-head debates. Yeah. They just haven't happened this time, have they?
And I think the thing is, it's not there. I mean, there have been lies and people coming out with statistics and statements that are clearly untrue, and the good thing about social media, I think to an extent, although there are bad sides to it as well, is that people are able to readily call that out and kind of democratically spread the word that this is a lie. And that's happened to all parties where they've misinformed people. So that's quite a healthy thing that does counteract that. But it also breeds cynicism because it highlights the lie in a way that we couldn't before, which is good in one way, but the politicians have got to adapt to it. I think the bigger problem, though, for the public is that they know the country's in a state, the economy's in a state. This is the worst parliament on record for people's living standards. Public services across the board are in crisis, huge backlogs in the courts, in the NHS, social care's a mess. You can't get a dentist, you can't get a GP's appointment. Schools have got a massive shortage of teachers, all those things. Climate change is massive, housing, migration. And have we seriously debated those issues in this campaign? I don't think so. I don't think people have heard solutions to those problems. And, we've had a kind of very stage-managed framing of the debate by the political parties that don't really want to open this up to scrutiny. And if they do, it's more just slinging mud at the other party rather than kind of setting out what they're going to do. And I think that's frustrated people a lot as well, because we haven't really heard competing visions for the next 5-10 years. And I think that's unhealthy. I think the other thing as well, which kind of goes back to that John Major, which I am just about old enough to remember John Major on his soapbox, not necessarily Thatcher's press conferences. But, how many walkabouts in city centres have we seen by leading politicians in this election? I mean, they happened in 2019, they happened in 2017. I mean, I know Boris hid in the fridge at one point, but, he was actually out in public. We haven't seen much of that at all. And the problem is that leaves it open to people like Nigel Farage, who do speak off the cuff, not somebody I admire at all, but he gives the illusion. Indeed he does, and he gives the illusion of somebody who speaks freely and honestly in a way that actually the other party leaders don't, I'm afraid. And that's a worry, that they're vacating that space to somebody who is a snake oil salesman.
What really brought that home was in the seven-way debates when he said, well, of course, all these other six, they're reading from an auto cue. I'm not, I'm just speaking. And of course, you immediately think to yourself, well, if he can do that, why can't they? If you can't speak for 90 seconds on why your party should win, don't be in the debate at all.
Exactly. I mean, I think one thing those seven-way debates did show, I think, is actually the more
They were actually the
detailed.
best
I think they
debates.
were the best ones because you got more
So
of
I've
a
never
challenge
thought
because
they
of the
would.
Greens, the Lib Dems, Plaid and the SNP actually threw something into the mix that was a bit different than the kind of pantomime of Labour versus Tory that we get at PMQs. And the head-to-heads were just like watching an extended PMQs, which is pretty dull.
Alys, do you think that this has been particularly the case on economic policy, where there hasn't been enough honesty, particularly about taxes?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about dishonesty, I think there's been two different kinds on display at this election. I think we've had the Tory party kind of reeling from the insult of Partygate, Rishi Sunak saying he was going to restore accountability and professionalism and so on. And then, lo and behold, we've got MPs betting on the result of the election campaign. But there's another kind of dishonesty that Labour are employing, and that's a kind of dishonesty of omission. And that is about not being upfront about what they are going to do to solve the country's economic challenges. And it leaves people in the city, for example, guessing what taxes they're going to rise, guessing that it's going to be capital gains tax. And that's not being upfront with people either.
It isn't. But no party in an election campaign. I mean, if you remember back to 1992, which you were in short trousers, Andrew, Bob and I can remember it, where John Smith did a shadow budget. Was it just after the election was announced? Yeah, it was, wasn't it? And basically gave the impression that taxes were going to go up, and so the Tories just concentrated on that Labour tax bombshell, £1,250 more.
I remember those posters. Yeah.
Well, at the age of 3.
12, I'm afraid. A bit older than I look.
But I mean that was. I mean, there was a good ding dong about that. There hasn't. Although the Tories were moderately successful in turning the sort of cameras onto tax for, say, 10 days, didn't really have a big impact, did it?
I don't think it had a big impact because people are sick of the Tories and they don't trust them on, they've blown their credibility on the economy. But I think Labour are about to do the same very quickly. They're going to get into government. They're going to find out that the debt situation is particularly precarious. I mean, the city has made very clear that if they borrow more than expected, the bond markets will react just as aggressively as they did to Liz Truss with her unfunded tax cuts. So I do think that these things have real world consequences. I mean, if you're talking about capital gains tax, for example, even just the rumour that this is going to go up has distortionary consequences. People start offloading assets or not selling assets. So it is a real problem, I think, people not being upfront, and we're going to find out very quickly, what those consequences of that are going to be.
OK, we'll move on in just a moment. You're listening to Cross Question, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's coming up to 8:15.
Britain Decides. The general election results live this Thursday from 10 p.m. on LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:15. Malcolm in Bodmin. Andrew Fisher on the Dale Show again. And he's a lefty.
Wow, there we are. I mean, I can't remember the last time I was on Cross Question, to be honest. It was a while back, Ian. It's not.
I think it was actually relatively recent.
Was it?
Yeah. Anyway, you're always welcome, Andrew.
Thank
You're always
you.
good value.
Not with Malcolm, I'm not. Obviously.
No, not with that much. There's always one, though.
Yeah,
isn't there?
never
There's always
mind.
one.
Can't
that you
please
can never
everyone.
please. We're all pleased that Bob Neill is with us, former Conservative MP, Alys Denby, opinion and features editor at City AM, and Joe Twyman from Deltapoll. Right, let's go to a text question from Jamie in York. When the Tories lose tomorrow, will it be because of D-Day, Partygate, or the mini budget? Alys.
Well, I have a thesis that actually it all goes back a long way before that. I think there are two B words. I think it's Boris Johnson and I think it's Brexit. I think that there is a kind of counterfactual where Boris Johnson didn't support Brexit, where therefore Remain won the referendum, and right now George Osborne is fighting for his second term as Prime Minister. I think that all of the things follow from the chaos of Brexit, the massive divisions in the party, the fact that the Tories were completely incapable of governing because all efforts were directed towards Brexit. I mean, there was a period, if you remember, under Theresa May, when the entire civil service was told to prepare for a no-deal Brexit that never happened. No wonder the country's in the state that it's in, because nobody's been able to govern. And on top of that, if we hadn't have gone into the pandemic, having already had the massive economic shock of Brexit, the pandemic wouldn't have been as damaging as it was. This is just my pet theory. Everybody is welcome to massively disagree.
No, it's very, very interesting. You've just booked a chapter in my next counterfactuals book. Bob.
I have a lot of sympathy with that, actually, Ian, because I do think the problem, and again, I look at my old constituency, which was prosperous London suburbs, liked Cameron. They liked that sort of view that was basically liberal economically, but also liberal socially, and voted Remain in the referendum. Not massively, but by enough. Now, I think the electoral coalition that they represented, which was an important part of the Conservative Party, so the prosperous middle classes, professional people, younger people, remember, lots of young people in London, out those London suburbs, voting for Cameron in 2010, 2015. Brexit, for good or ill, fractured that coalition. And the way it was handled thereafter made it impossible to put back together. It might have been, I'd argue, if Theresa had seized the initiative and said, actually, we're going for a pretty light touch Brexit, while she had the authority of having become Prime Minister, and if perhaps there had been a different leader other than Jeremy Corbyn on the Labour side, who might have been prepared to adopt a more consensual approach, I think maybe we could have repaired some of those fractures. But that didn't happen. And I think that then laid the ground for concern, which you're right was compounded by, I think, the way Boris handled all the stuff around Partygate. If he had fessed up, I think, at the beginning, said, look, we got this badly wrong. This shouldn't have happened. People were under pressure, but they shouldn't have done it. People might have taken a different view. And then, of course, I agree that the Liz Truss mini budget, I think, simply blew the economic competence. Put those together, I think that's the inheritance that Rishi Sunak has had to try and pick up.
What you said about Theresa May there, I think, is really interesting, because I think it proves that you're never more powerful as Prime Minister than you are in your first few months.
Absolutely.
And if you don't take advantage of that, and if you've got unpopular things to do it then. I mean, if he wants to give MPs a 30,000 pay rise, do it on day one and just take the flak.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he will do that, by the way.
But in fairness, Cameron as an example, even with the coalition, they did do that.
Yeah.
They got to business very quickly in that 2010 period. And I think there was a start of it in 2015, but of course then the referendum result derailed that too. And I think that's a lesson for Keir Starmer.
And can I just add that I do think that the way that Boris has kind of popped up at the last minute really shows what kind of the level of contempt he has for the Conservative Party.
Don't criticise Boris. My text screen will go mad. Apparently I'm the most evil person because I had the temerity to criticise Boris for making only a 9-minute speech. So be prepared.
I'm prepared. Bring it on.
Andrew Fisher.
I think it's austerity predominantly. I think people look at the public services. I think they look at the NHS. I think they look at the teachers in schools, the lack of qualified teachers in schools. They look at social care, and they look at the councils collapsing around the country. Universities are about to join that as well. There's many on the brink at the moment. I think that's a big part of it as well. And I think we wouldn't be where we are in terms of NHS backlogs, which is in all the polling I've seen either the number one or number two issue at this election. That's due to austerity. That's due to the fact we had 1% increases in the NHS, which is well below the average, well below what it needs actually just to keep pace in that in those years of 2010 to 2019. So whilst I agree with Bob in what he said about David Cameron managed to build a coalition of kind of liberal economically and liberal socially kind of voters, actually the aftermath of austerity just, I think, killed them off. And it very nearly did for Theresa May in 2017. You know, part of the reason that she lost her majority was about that. It was predominantly about public services and austerity. You know, they'd given huge tax cuts to corporations, to the very well-off, and then cut public services. And I think people reacted against that. And I think Brexit kind of distracted for a while, reshaped coalition, which Boris Johnson then managed to grab. But that wasn't sustainable in the long term. Once Brexit stopped being an issue, that fell apart. And I think that's what the Conservative Party are living with. And of course, all the things that your caller mentioned, Partygate, the mini budget, the various scandals that there have been of MPs, which is very reminiscent of the John Major Parliament in 92 to 97 again, has just compounded that lack of trust, lack of faith in politics, and means they're probably going to get the worst ever result, or, you know, certainly going back to the 19th century tomorrow.
Joe Twyman?
I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I will answer in terms of the sort of hard, sterile numbers answer. The reason that parties lose elections is because they are behind when it comes to the question of leadership and when it comes to the question of economic competence. It's never been the case in British polling history that a party has come from behind on both of those to win the most seats at a general election. You win those, that's the game. And the Conservatives have been behind on both by some distance for some time. And that began, in advance of callers and your screen lighting up, that began under Boris Johnson. In the immediate aftermath of the COVID pandemic, as rules started to be loosened, that's when the Conservatives' position on both leadership and economic competence started to decline. It then accelerated a lot under Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak managed to stabilise things, but he never managed to close the gap. And that is why the Conservatives find themselves in this position now.
Can I just say on the austerity point, I mean, actually, the real problem goes back to 2008 and the financial crash. And since then, we've never had growth above sort of something like 2%. We did get some growth under the coalition, but that's the real problem. The deep structural problems that mean that we can't build anything, that we can't grow. Austerity was a reaction to the financial crash, but really we haven't recovered from it yet.
Wrong reaction, though. And it's compounded the problem, the economic problem, because now you've got huge waiting lists, 7.6 million people. Many of those are people that could be in work and aren't because of that. And the problem is we've had the lowest investment in this country for years. You know, we were overly reliant on the City of London, and when that collapsed, we just haven't got another economic model. You know, that's the problem. We have not replaced the City of London as its engine of growth.
I don't think you can necessarily put it, Adam, in simple terms as that, when Britain is essentially a services-driven economy and very successful.
Every major economy is.
Yeah, but in particular for us, and that's been a good thing. It's the tax revenues from the city that have been invested into record levels of money into the health service. Now, for demographic reasons, then certainly there's growing pressure on the health service, and there's a big discussion, which, again, none of us are having, I think, as the parties, about what do you do about funding the health service for the future? What do you do about funding, particularly adult social care, which is a massive problem? That's actually the detail we should be talking about in the election,
as well.
and we're not. But I think against that background, it was necessary in 2010 to stabilise the economy before you could then start to have meaningful investment. Otherwise, you would have got into the same sort of distrust scenarios, borrowing more, and that would, I think, have destabilised the markets and would put us at a greater risk.
And I think as a representative of City, I have to object to the idea that you should replace the City of London. I think it's a massive asset to the country, and even Labour says that.
They do say that. I'm not sure that's particularly wise. And look how it turned out last time under New Labour when they decided deregulating the City of London was the best thing. I'm not sure it works.
Well, that's probably a good subject for an entire programme at some point, so I shall bear you in mind as a guest, in fact, both of you as a guest for that. Right, follow-up text question from Olivia in Birmingham. Does who the Sun endorses really make any difference in these days when nobody buys a newspaper anywhere? Well, that's not strictly true. The Sun still has a very healthy circulation, but you're right, newspapers in general have gone down. They did it in a slightly understated way, but if you look at the draft front page that they've got, it looks as if they're talking about Gareth Southgate. They said England needs a new manager or something along those lines. Do newspaper endorsements matter nowadays at all, Joe?
Well, they matter to some degree to some people, and in a close election that may make a difference. I don't think the Sun's endorsement is going to make a significant impact this time around, not least because it's such a half-cocked approach to endorsement, and it's basically just saying, oh well, we'll go with them. I doubt.
Doesn't that reflect the electorate though?
Well, I think it reflects the electorate to some extent, but I think if you're looking for an endorsement to make a difference, it has to be a full-throated, ongoing endorsement throughout the entire campaign, and getting something in just before the deadline is not going to make much difference either. There, it will not be the Sun what won it.
No, the Times still hasn't endorsed anyone, which I would have thought if the Sun has gone for Labour, I think the Times would. But I mean, it's a bit late now, isn't it?
Sunday Times
has,
yeah.
but the Times hasn't. Which I think is odd that they haven't said anything. Alys?
I mean, I'm always a bit
Has
suspicious.
City AM endorsed anybody?
Well, I encourage your listeners to read the editorial that we published this morning. It's sort of Tories don't deserve to win, but Labour, must be held to account.
So vote reform then?
I wouldn't. I mean, no. Sorry.
What's the point of
unanimity
what's the point of writing on one hand and on the other hand editorial?
Well, ask the editor. But I think the City AM wants to see a government that supports the City of London, that's interested in free markets and all of those kind of things. And I think we don't believe that the Tory party in its current state is that, and nor do we think Labour is. But on the question of the Sun, I mean, I've always been a bit suspicious of the idea that Rupert Murdoch somehow is this kind of puppet master that seeks to manipulate the media. I think his main interest is in selling papers. And in order to do that, he makes his papers align with where the public are. And I think it's very clear how the public are going to vote. And I think that's why he's decided that the Sun is endorsing Labour. I think because that's where the public are. I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
I wonder how much influence he himself has in that decision. Or do you think he actually dictates it, or do you think he is part of a group that decides it?
I have no idea. I'm not involved in editorial meetings at the Sun.
Is he?
Well, another one.
Yeah, I'm not saying that as a flippant
you may be right.
comment. I think he genuinely might
he is,
be.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Andrew?
Well, I know nothing of Rupert Murdoch's love life, and I want to keep it that way, frankly. But I don't think the Sun's as influential as it was. I mean, I was looking up the readership figures actually because I was curious as to what it was compared with, say, 92. They had 4 million readers then. They're down to 1 million. Now, of course, they've still got an online readership, which is probably quite large as well. But, they are less influential. And I think your caller's right that the newspapers, it's not that nobody reads the newspapers, but they are less read and they are less influential. And, I think it's always been overemphasised, really, how much people just kind of read the newspaper and go, well, I better vote that way then. But it's about the climate they create. And I think actually the Sun has been responsible for pumping poison into our political veins for a long time. And, the amount of bigotry, when I was growing up against gay people, single mothers, more recently against disabled people, people on benefits, is absolutely vile. And to be honest, I wouldn't want their endorsement, frankly.
Bob?
I think newspapers don't have the clout that they did. I'm sure it does make a difference, and I'd rather any major newspaper was endorsing my party than not. But how much of a difference it will make in the overall scheme of things, I'm not so certain of now. It might in some seats, it might on the margins. I think that's the thing. What I picked up certainly on the doorsteps is people do, interestingly, take a lot more notice of the candidates' social media. I was quite struck. A number of people have said, "Oh yeah, we've seen your guy or somebody else's
don't mention
stuff." I won't mention the name, but I've seen X or Y's social media posts, and they've either liked it or they haven't. And I think that's quite interesting. That's a format where, if they do it well, if the candidates, whichever side, do it well, that can actually have perhaps a very useful impact.
And it's interesting. These community sites next door, they I think are going to be quite influential.
They I think, have more influence.
I don't read our local one, but my partner does, and is constantly telling me, they've been saying this and that, and
that's right.
You think, well, that is a new phenomenon.
It is. It's something that when
ago.
I was a candidate in the past, I wouldn't have picked up, Iain. No. I've seen it this time in a way that you haven't before.
Right, great question there. We will come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30. Time for the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Political parties have been making their final attempts to win over voters. Rishi Sunak insists he's fighting until the end, while Sir Keir Starmer says people can't rely on a Labour win if they don't vote. A judge has ruled there is sufficient evidence for the former leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, to stand trial over historical sex offences. He's previously said he'll strenuously deny the accusations. The daughter and son-in-law of Captain Tom Moore have been banned from being charity trustees. The Charity Commission made the decision as an inquiry continues into the foundation set up in the war veteran's name. LBC weather, largely dry tonight, some blustery showers in the northwest and a low of 4 degrees.
Weekdays from 7am.
No one's buying a word you say.
Straight to the point.
That's one that's not been fully thought through.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
That was either misleading or a lie, wasn't it?
Listen on your radio and Global Player, the official LBC app. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:32 on LBC. Sir Bob Neill, Alys Denby, Andrew Fisher and Joe Twyman with me answering your calls. Let's go to Chris in Southend. Chris, hello.
Oh, yes, good evening, Ian. Thanks for taking my call.
Hi.
Just want to quickly say a few things. I've worked as a truck driver for the last 5 or 6 years. I've worked for every single penny that I've earned in my life. I've never given any handouts. I do get a little bit fed up with the rhetoric in the media that somehow our productivity is the fault of work-shy, bone-idle, lazy workers. When in actual fact it's not. A lot of it is due to poor infrastructure. I mean, I was over in Spain before the new year, and yeah, how is it they've got roads with no potholes in them, brilliant high-speed trains, and local trams and metro systems that seem to work perfectly fine. So that's what I'd say to them. But the question I'd like to say is that, and it relates actually to something that was on Tom Swarbrick's show, your colleague, that there is billions of pounds waiting to be spent on, building and infrastructure projects. Not just obviously roads, rails and tunnels, but, housing and, hospital wards, things like that. There's billions wrapped up in pension funds, but that money is not being spent because of the planning laws. Now, this is hindering our productivity, or lack of investment in infrastructure. So I would like to, this is the question I'd pose to the panel, what would Labour do if they got in power, which, assuming the polls are right, they are, what would they do if they got in power to modify and streamline the planning laws?
Right, Andrew Fisher. You were in charge of drafting the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. This, I guess, was a subject that you're very familiar with. Labour have talked a good game on this and on reforming the planning laws. And I've always thought, well, if Michael Gove failed as a reforming minister, how can we have confidence that Labour can actually deliver what he failed to do?
I think there are two things that are different for Labour. One is they're going to come in with a very large majority and a mandate for this. I think Michael Gove, you can judge whether he was well-intentioned or not, but the problem is there are a lot of Conservatives who have played into that kind of NIMBY kind of argument. You saw it with David Cameron even, where he virtually banned onshore wind because of the regulations he put blocking that. And you look at other countries around Europe and indeed the US who have massively expanded onshore wind in the last 10, 15 years, and we haven't. We've been left behind on that, and that's a real problem. And of course, that's true on things like housing. I think Labour will face some reaction on this. The stuff they talk about trying to have this definition between the green belt and the grey belt, which is, let's face it, about judgment, not a real thing. There is no grey belt. But there are bits of greenbelt land that aren't what you and I would think of as greenbelt.
Well, I own one bit of that land, and which is it's classified as greenbelt and an area of outstanding natural beauty. If any of you four came to visit me and looked at my property, you would not class it as that.
Yeah, and there is that. So some of this can be freed up, and I think part of it's necessity why Labour's doing this, because they don't want to make the argument for more borrowing. They've ruled out virtually every tax rise you can possibly have that will raise any substantial capital. So therefore they've got to kind of do a liberalisation, deregulation kind of approach to trying to kickstart the economy, and that's what they're doing on planning. And it's pretty much all that they've boxed themselves in so much. It's pretty much all they've got. But yes, it does need to happen. We do need to build more housing. We've been well under. I mean, the last Conservative manifesto, Bob will probably know better than me, pledged to build 300,000 homes a year. They haven't even got close to meeting that in any one of the last 5 years. And that's not a particularly big target. I mean, I think the Lib Dems put 380,000 a year in their manifesto. Labour have stuck with 300,000.
Well, it's worse than that, because I'm told that in the last year there were only 90,000 starts.
Yeah, that's right. It's gone down, actually, over the last couple of years, which
and that's
you wouldn't have
because
expected.
Michael Gove abolished the targets for local authorities.
Exactly, which again is playing into this kind of NIMBYist kind of audience, which I think Labour will have less of. But the thing is, they're going to win in seats where that is a factor, and they're going to have MPs representing those seats where they are under those pressures. They're not just urban MPs where it's not really a factor. So there will be interesting discussions, I think, and debates, and the dynamic of this will be quite interesting. But it's one of those things I think Bob was referring to. You just need to get in there and do it early. And on energy as well, and on rail. I mean, I've been to Spain a lot, been to France. They've got networks of high-speed rail. We've been arguing for 15 years over one tiny line, and now we're going to build half of it. It's pretty pathetic when you look around Europe, and countries that are not as well off as we are overall in terms of size of economy have got high-speed rail networks. Not only that, they've had them for decades. It's quite embarrassing, really, that we haven't invested, which goes back to my point, actually, about borrowing to invest. You've got to make the case for that.
Bob?
I think there's interesting, serious number of points here. Interesting, fun enough, one of the things that Spain did was it actually used very wisely the cohesion funds it got when it became a member of the EU after Franco went. Actually, a lot of the investment in Spain goes back to then. They used it very sensibly and have actually benefited from that thereafter. Second, I think we do have a problem the way the Treasury operates in the UK in terms of the business case that you have to make for major infrastructure investments and the borrowing regime for that, which is much too short-termist and actually much too restrictive as to what the overall economic benefits are. I think that's something I'd urge any new Chancellor to grip and change early on. In relation to planning specifically, there is, I'm sorry, always this big NIMBYish tendency that we have that pushes back. The last really major planning reform was when I was Eric Pickles Junior Minister with Greg Clark, and we brought in something called the National Planning Policy Framework, which had as its centre a presumption in favour of sustainable development, which I think was the right thing to do. It's a presumption that we should build where we can do so. Sites like yours, Iain, I think would have fitted well into that. So I think there's an important point about protecting those green areas which fulfil a green function. Maybe Greenbelt is too loose a term now to accurately encompass what's required. So maybe we could look at the definitions to more accurately represent what's on the ground. But there are some really important green areas, green buffers that separate, development, habitations, and so on. And the final thing I'd say to speed up infrastructure planning is, we try to do that with our national infrastructure schemes. But what we haven't done is grass the nettle that they have done in France and many of the other Code Napoleon type systems, which is the land compensation regime. The reason that we get bogged down, it's fights over the planning, because that comes back down to how much am I going to get for my detriment for having this infrastructure near me. The French simply pay 1.5 times, 2 times market value, and sorry, you're going to have to take the hit for the greater good, but we're going to look after you well for having taken that hit for the broader good. We've not grasped that nettle. Maybe we should.
And also the planning departments, the local authorities have been hollowed out to such an extent. You wonder, well, OK, if there is going to be this hyperactivity, where are the planning officers going to come from?
We've got a massive shortage of planning officers at the moment.
Alys?
Yeah, I think Chris is absolutely right. And you'll know, Chris, that infrastructure is a massive drag on growth. If you take one specific project, a road project, it's the Lower Thames Crossing. It's this desperately needed crossing to the east of the Thames, to the east of London. There's no other crossing. The Dartford crossing is massive. massively over capacity. It's been going on for nearly a decade. It's the most expensive planning application in history. On the planning application alone, we've spent more, something like £250 million, than it cost Norway to build the biggest, longest road tunnel in the world. So it's absurd. Like, the planning system is insane. It needs radical overhaul. We need to get rid of ridiculous rules about newts and environmentalists, whatever. We just need to tear it all up and start again and make sure we can build stuff, because otherwise we can't grow. And if we can't grow, we can't fund public services, and we can't have the kind of living standards that people like Chris deserve.
All because of the newts.
All because of the crested newts.
What have you got against the crested
They
newt?
hold up.
They need to be protected.
They don't. They're everywhere. They're increasingly common newt because we've protected them so much. I think we could build over some of their habitats without, ruining nature.
Goodness. Don't tweet me, tweet Alys. Joe.
I don't think they taste very nice.
Oh my God!
Water.
No, I mean my serious answer is that I expect Labour to do something very radical, actually, in the first 100 days, because it's, as Andrew articulated, it's an area where they can set out a real difference between themselves and the other government, and it's really important for them to deliver some sort of retail offering to younger voters who overwhelmingly vote Labour and who are increasingly concerned by the issue of housing. And so if you don't solve an issue, solve is perhaps too strong a word, if you aren't perceived to be addressing the issue of housing, and significantly within your first 100 days, you'll be in trouble. And so I think we'll see some pretty whether they're actually radical or whether they appear to be radical remains to be seen, but I think we'll certainly see a lot of announcements on that from the get-go.
Mm. Right, let's move on to another question. It's Chris, thank you very much for that. It's from Matt in Hassocks in West Sussex. He says, given the overwhelming consensus for a Labour landslide, how powerful do the panel think polls are, in informing the public's decision-making, not just representing it? Well, let's go to our expert pollster. I have a theory, Joe, that after the election, one of the big talking points will be how influential these MRP polls have been on people either voting or staying at home, or who they're voting for.
Yeah, I think a lot could be. I mean, we could do an entire show. You and I, Ian, not the rest. They wouldn't have to put up with it. Could do an entire show on the MRP polls. And I think their use in this election, particularly at a constituency level, is completely misplaced. Because anyone who actually knows anything about this knows that these polls, firstly, include a series of decisions and assumptions that vary from pollster to pollster, and crucially, don't take account of hyper-local factors. This is not one contest, this is 650 individual contests. And so saying on a leaflet that this MRP survey or that MRP poll says that Labour can't win here or the Conservatives can't win here, that is a misrepresentation, an understandable misrepresentation, but nonetheless the misrepresentation of what the data should actually be used for. And so I think there is an issue around that, and it will be interesting to see, given the range of projections that the final MRP results have produced over the last couple of days. I think it will be really interesting to see if there is now an acceptance that it is more complicated than that, and that translating share of the vote to share of the seats, particularly to individual seats, is simply not the kind of thing that you can do when you have 650 constituencies of around 70,000 people each.
Anybody else want to comment on polls, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, and without naming individual constituencies, because I know the problems in doing that. I was looking.
You can name constituencies,
okay,
not candidates.
Okay, all right. Well, let's take the example of Chingford and Wimford Green, where there is a high-profile independent standing, probably the second most high-profile independent standing in this election. One of the MRP polls that came out earlier this week put that person on 2.8%. Now, nobody seriously thinks that they're going to get 2.8%, but of course, you can't take into effect local factors, and even if you could, there is no precedent for independents doing very, very well in many of the seats where they are. So the information it's drawing on is not relevant, and it's because it just kind of looks at where votes are moving in different places and tries to apply it where on the basis of what went before in that constituency. It's very hard to do. So I think there is a danger of people, because we have got a more sophisticated electorate that does and clearly is looking at tactical voting this time. It can reinforce decisions that are quite inaccurate. And I remember in the last election, there was one poll in, I think, Kensington, where it put the Lib Dems second, and actually it ended up being very, very tight between Labour and the Conservatives. And this particular, which was an anti-Tory or anti-Brexit kind of poll, not pollster, but a tactical voting site, advocated a Lib Dem vote when actually the more strategic thing would have been to vote Labour, and it was actually a very narrow defeat for Labour there. So these things can deform people, because I think people see these statistics and think, oh, that's official. It give it a resonance that it actually, as Joe explained, it doesn't always deserve.
Yeah. Chingford's a really good example, because we just don't know.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any decent or even bad polling done at a constituency.
Is there a broader point too, though, do you think? That the way that these MRPs in particular have been sort of overhyped almost, it has actually crowded out some of the other debate. An awful lot of debate, a lot of the media focus has been on polls rather than on policy positions.
I think that's because the politicians have avoided talking about policy to a large extent.
And it goes two ways. It's a fault on the politicians maybe for not being upfront about where the hard choices are. But of course, that's very easy then to have a comfort blanket about let's talk about the MRPs because they're coming out on almost daily basis.
I would like to say that as someone who's never shied away from a media appearance, you
are known in this building as Joe Tard.
Well, I don't know
media time.
Oh, right, okay, that's fine.
Actually, I made that up, by the way. But
I'm less interested now. But seriously, if you've got to fill a 24-hour news cycle, and as Andrew said, the politicians are tightly controlling things, and there is a day to fill, it doesn't surprise me that you go for one of the 16 or 17 polls out that day.
How will we manage in those places where they don't allow polls during election campaigns?
Well, France, for example. See what happened there. Alys.
I think they've had, in some ways, a positive effect and actually made people analyse policies a bit more closely. So, for example, in City AM, we have a piece today looking at what a Lib Dem opposition might be like, because polls have suggested that could be a possibility. So I think actually it can increase scrutiny. And I can only speak, I'm not an expert like Joe, but from my own personal experiences, I do think that the polling is perhaps going to influence how I vote. I think it makes me feel pretty safe because Labour are so obviously going to win, to vote for another party when otherwise I might not have bothered to vote at all. And I think there'll probably be quite a few people who feel that way, perhaps some shy Tories, perhaps some undecideds who at the last minute we know the result, so I'll go Tory or I'll go Reform or whatever it might be. So I think maybe there are some positive consequences or consequences general, whether positive or negative.
OK, right, more questions in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. Sir Bob Neill, Alys Denby, Andrew Fisher and Joe Twyman on our panel tonight. Here's a text question from Kieran in Freiburg in Germany. How long do you think it's fair before Labour's policies will be called out? They obviously have a lot to do to meet their manifesto at the next election in 5 years or sooner. I mean, that's almost saying, well, how long's their honeymoon period going to be? Bob?
I think it's going to be pretty short, actually. For some of the reasons I think Alys referred to earlier, because they've not been terribly upfront, frankly, about the costs of their plans, which the public might or might not like if they knew them, because they haven't been. Because I think there is, for a raft of reasons, a serious economic problem that they face, particularly around the levels of debt and lots of other pressures on public spending at the same time that demand is going up. I think it's going to be a very short honeymoon period, and that's going to be the real test of Keir Starmer, who's done a lot to change the Labour Party. I give him credit for that, but how much is he going to be able to keep control of what might be a large parliamentary party, which may have a number of people who may not have expected to be there, who may not be as brought into the Starmer project, if you like, as some of the people in the target seats will have been? Is he going to have a pretty unmanageable party, which, as we saw with the Diane Abbott incidents and so on, might be used by some within the party to try and attack him, and then the public saying, well, you never told us it was going to be like this. So I think there's some very real risks for them, and I think the honeymoon period could be pretty short, which is why it's important that my party gets its act together swiftly and doesn't indulge itself in some sort of ideological fantasy land of trying to sort of reinvent itself on some hard right platform or going off to talk about deals with other parties and so forth. They've got to get their sense together and say, look, we're a party of the centre right, but centre is as important as right, because that's the way you win an election, have a credible alternative.
Alys?
I don't think he'll have a honeymoon period at all. I don't think that this election, this landslide he's going to win is a tremendous vote of confidence in him. I think it's an outright rejection of the Conservatives. I think that the central promise that he's made is a promise to get the economy growing, absolutely the right one. That's not going to happen overnight. And I do think that everything we know about the sort of policies that he's going to look to try and get there, things like industrial strategy, like wealth tax, like windfall tax, is actually cut against everything we know about how you get to growth. And I think if we don't see the economy growing within a couple of years, well, then I think he'll be in desperate trouble, and a lot will depend on how the Conservatives can get themselves together by the next election.
Joe?
I think you need to look at honeymoon periods in two different ways. Firstly, there's the simple voting intention question, and I imagine that, as Alys and Bob said, it will be relatively short, and that Labour will take a hit quickly for the reasons that have been articulated. But underneath that, when we look at things like leadership and economic management, these two so important variables that we talked about earlier, I think the honeymoon period there, or at least the period at which Labour are ahead relatively to the Conservatives, will last for a fair while, because I imagine the Conservatives will take longer to get their act together. And indeed, when you go back to Blair in 1997, yes, he had a long honeymoon period, and the party performed well, but they stayed ahead on the economy from 1992 to 2008. These things have a very, very long tail to them, and so I imagine that, if you like, the proper honeymoon will not last long, but the loving marriage may sustain.
Andrew?
I'm slightly more pessimistic, I'm afraid, than Joe, because unlike Tony Blair in 1997, Keir Starmer's not inheriting a growing economy. He's inheriting an economy that's basically flatlining and has been stagnant, rightly, as has been said, since the banking crash. We've had an average of 1% growth since 2008, which is pretty anemic. And that's not going to turn around overnight, but it's also needs substantial reform to do that. And the impact on public services is still being felt. NHS waiting lists are getting longer, not shorter. We have a widening crisis in teacher recruitment. We have a widening crisis in social care. And there is literally no policy in Labour's manifesto about social care. I mean, to their credit, actually, the Lib Dems have got one. It's virtually what Labour and the Lib Dems did in Scotland when they were in coalition 20 years ago, actually. But there's so many problems that they're going to face. And all of the frustration that is now currently focused rightly on the Tories, because they've been in power for 14 years and have caused most of this, is going to transfer over fairly quickly, I think, onto Labour if it doesn't start improving. And I don't think it will overnight, even with the best of intention and a fair wind, because there are other things coming down the train, coming down the road. People are still remortgaging onto much higher rates at the moment. And that's going to continue under Labour, which will dampen, people's living standards and consumer spending. There are a whole range of things where I think they've got a very tough call, which is why I think they did need to be more upfront and say, look, some taxes are going to have to rise because we have to fund public services. There's no way of getting NHS waiting lists down, really, without improving the tax base.
Okay,
so,
now we've just got time if we finish there for one more question. It's from John in Broughty Ferry in the east of Scotland. John, very good evening.
Good evening. Hi, Ian. I'm a little bit starstruck to speak to you, so thank you for all that you do.
I can assure you I'm very normal.
Tomorrow I'm going to work as a poll clerk, so I'd like to ask the panel how many potential voters do they think will be disenfranchised by the need for voter ID tomorrow?
Now, the Electoral Commission says at least 0.25% of people who tried to vote at a polling station during the local elections in May 2023 were not able to vote because of the voter ID requirements. Now, as I understand it, in the 2024 local elections, there were still many people who couldn't, but most of them then went back and got ID, so they did in the end. So it was actually a comparatively small number, but it obviously is a phenomenon. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a poll clerk before many years ago and a presiding officer, so it's quite, it'll probably be a relatively quiet day for a general election. I mean, I think having looked at some of the polling, and Joe, I'm sure, will put me right on this, it's actually looking like turnout might be a bit lower than it has been in the last couple of general elections at the moment. So, let's see. And obviously, there are different dynamics in different parts of the country which will, counteract that. But I think the voter ID thing is wrong, and I think the way it's been implemented is wrong in that, let's take an example, and I'm sorry to be very localised in this, in London. Your free bus pass, if you're over 60, counts as legitimate ID. Your young person's bus pass, if you're still in full-time education and, in your early 20s or in your late teens, doesn't count as legitimate ID. And there are a number of examples like that where the sort of ID that young people actually might have, because a lot haven't got a driving licence because they can't afford a car, so there's no much point learning to drive. A lot haven't got a passport because, times is tough. It is a problem, and
Okay.
I think it will be a bit of a suppression of
My problem is
turnout.
we're running out of time, so we need fairly brief
Sorry.
answers. That's absolutely fine. Bob?
I don't think it'll have a very great impact now. You're right about what happened in the 2004 pilot. Bromley was one of the pilots. The vast majority of people went back and got them, and people, I think, have wised up to that. And we know full well that in Northern Ireland, they've had it for a long time. It's not been a suppressant there. And, of course, in most other Western democracies, you rock up and produce your ID card, and it's accepted as entirely the norm. We can look about refinements and some of the points about what type of ID, younger people's as well as older folks. That's something we can look at, but I don't think it's going to be a major suppressant across the piece.
Stuart says, I'll go to my polling station without ID to have my non-vote recorded. Well done, you, Stuart. Joe?
The Electoral Commission survey, Electoral Commission research was based on local elections. The turnout for those is around about 35-40%. The turnout for general elections around about 60%, we estimate this time around. That 20% difference is the big unknown, because there are people who vote at general elections who don't vote at local elections, and the assumption is that those people may be less engaged and so might be within it's estimated 2.5% of people who don't have the right ID. Will it make a difference to the overall result? No, but will it make the difference in particular areas? Potentially, and could it reduce turnout? I think possibly.
Alys?
Not sure what more to add, except to also raise the problem we've seen with some of the postal ballots, people not getting them in time, particularly in Scotland. That's been a big problem. And then the other thing I'd just like to say is thank you to John, because it's people like him who keep the wheels of our democracy turning. So thanks very much.
Yeah, fair point.
John, if you're available on Friday evening, I'd love you to call in again and tell me your experience of being a presiding officer and how many people didn't manage to get the votes because of this voter ID. It would be really interesting to know if you're free on Friday. And seeing as you live up the road from Edinburgh, come and be a bit starstruck at my Edinburgh Fringe show from the 3rd to the 11th of August, and I can say hello to you or whatever.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. It's my first time working as a poll clerk, so whilst being a little bit starstruck, I'm also a little bit excited for tomorrow.
I bet you are. Well, I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much indeed. Now, a fun question from Sarah in Liverpool. It's nice of Rupert Murdoch and The Sun to decide now to back Starmer and Labour. What have you decided you were wrong about at the last possible moment? I think that's quite a difficult one. Who would like to kick off? Give the others a chance to
I'll give it a go.
think. Joe?
I remember on one occasion, about 20 years ago, I was competing at the World Masters Swimming Championships and dressed in my whole UK swimming finery when a friend of mine and I decided we'd go for a walk in the Redwood Forest in the hills of Northern California, near where we were competing in Stanford. And we didn't think we needed a map or any water or anything. And very quickly we realised this was a very bad decision. And at one point we thought they were going to find 2 dead bodies decked out in full UK swimming kit.
This is a revelation to us. So you're a championship swimmer. Did you
well, not anymore.
Well, no, but
I used to be quite good.
What was the height of your achievement?
I've won 3. I've set 3 British Masters records for relay teams.
Wow.
Man of many
Beat that, anybody. Alys?
Oh, mine does not reflect nearly as well on me as that story. Mine is that I actually stood my husband up on our first date. He forgave me in the end. But yeah, that was a wrong decision.
Why?
Because I was seeing someone else at the time.
Raisin hussy.
I know, but I did marry him in the end. So I feel like all is forgiven.
Bob?
Apart from putting bets on West Ham to sort of win the Premiership,
I wonder what you're going to say then.
Well, yeah, the only things I bet on. But as you know, those regrets don't come at the last moment. They come very early on, Ian, when we realise that we're never going to win the Premiership. But otherwise, ones that will be printable, I think I better draw a veil over.
Okay, Andrew.
I make lots of mistakes, don't we all? But I can't think of any particularly I've made at the last moment. I mean, I suppose I did decide after that goal went in for Jude Bellingham, just because you raised that in the break. I was there for that. I didn't walk out of the stadium like some of those fans had or walk away from the TV, but I did decide, I can take a break and go and get a snack. And by that point, I suddenly heard this shout as Harry Kane scored, it came straight back after extra time. So I only kind of caught the replay of that as I ran back into the lounge. But there we are.
Right, well, thank you all very much for coming in on the eve of poll. Andrew Fisher, Bob Neill, Alys Denby and Joe Twyman. Coming up next, over the last 5 decades, The Sun has supported both Labour and the Conservatives. They've come out for Labour today. But I know that there are lots of you out there that still don't know how you're going to vote. There are many of you who won't actually decide until you go behind the curtain in the ballot box. What is it called? Anyway, in the polling booth. And I've never understood this because I just think, well, surely you must know how you're going to vote before you walk into a polling station, but apparently not. What is going to help you make your decision? Is it a national newspaper like The Sun coming out for Labour? Does that influence you at all in the way that it might have done 30 years ago? I suspect not. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Labour's rejected claims it could have to consider increasing inheritance tax or bring in national insurance for working pensioners. The party says those are not its policies after one of its new advisers warned neither party is being honest about potential rises. Former HMRC Permanent Secretary Sir Edward Troop told LBC wealthy pensioners should be taxed at least as hard as those of working age.
If I'd gone on working after state pension age, I'd suddenly not have to pay national insurance. My generation is having it better than the generation who are currently working. When I say pensions, I don't mean pensioners who are not well off. I mean pensioners who work and have got income, have got capital gains.
The